You may start, Alka.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Alka Patel, professor in UCI's Department of Art History and the PhD program in Visual Studies, specializing in the art and architecture of South Asia and the Islamic world. I'm deeply grateful to the UCI Humanities Center for supporting this new In Conversation series titled Ideas with Impact, bringing university faculty together with professionals from other fields. Its principal aim is to highlight the manifold ways in which humanistic research meets today's global challenges. The series' current format of less formal conversation is meant to draw in specialists as well as those generally interested in the series topics. Initially, I and Dr. Amanda Swain, Executive Director of the UCI Humanities Center, had envisioned Ideas with Impact as a once quarterly series, but it quickly transformed into 5 events just this academic year, attesting to my UCI colleagues' encompassing consciousness and the wide relevance of their work. This is the second in our series, and I will introduce the event participants. First is George Hoare, a writer and broadcaster based in London, where he works for a mental health NGO. He, along with Philip Cunliffe and Alex Hohuli, host BungaCast. His books include An Introduction to Antonio Gramsci, published with Nathan Sperber by Bloomsbury in 2016. Alex Hohuli is also a co-host of BungaCast, translator, journalist, and media consultant. He is a regular contributor to Damage Magazine and Jacobin, and is co-author of The End of History, Politics in the 21st Century, along with George Hoare and Philip Cunliffe. And finally, our very own Professor Catherine Liu is Professor of Film and Media Studies at UC Irvine. Most recently, she has authored Virtue Hoarders, the case against the professional managerial class, which is the main point of discussion or the starting point today. She is also at work on a book on the theoretical historical configuration of trauma and the public sphere in the post-1968 world. So welcome, everyone. We're very eager to start the event.
Thank you, Olga, and thanks to the Humanities Center and Amanda and Saeed for making this possible. This is a great occasion for us to have George and Alex and me in conversation. I want to put a plug out for their podcast, BungaCast. They've been doing it for like 3 or 4 years now. They're one of the most successful political podcasts around right now. They cover global history, global politics. Much of the material comes out of their own discontent with political science as a discipline and their own experiences in departments of political science, international relations, and political philosophy. So one of the things that first got us together was that I think George and Philip and Alex had read my book, American Idyll, Academic Antielitism as Cultural Critique. And it turns out that we're all really interested in populism. We were really interested in the way in which liberalism was demonizing populism through the noughts into the 2010s. And I've been interested really in this kind of like anti-intellectual cultural studies populism that has sort of implanted itself in academia as a kind of, I would say, pseudo-left. The End of History, their book, is sort of a culmination of a lot of stuff that they've been doing on the podcast. I think academics, I don't know what they're thinking about podcasts. I'm sort of deeply involved in left media right now, left podcasts. I think right now there's a kind of ecology of podcasts that's sort of infotainment, and some of them are very, very well produced. But BungaCast is one of a number of left podcasts I would say provides a para-academic, para-theoretical place where you can really do kind of deep dive into geopolitical issues. And one of the things that they are doing in the podcast, well, as they used to be called Auf Hey Bunga Bunga, because they were interested in Berlusconi and Hegel. Please correct me, guys, if I'm wrong and mischaracterizing you. I know we're supposed to be in conversation, so
No,
if you're just like, oh my God, Catherine, that is just completely ridiculous. No, so just I just want to put that out there.
No, that's right. Berlusconi and Hegel. It might be a little bit opaque, but that's basically the story. Yeah.
Yeah, like how can we have, and they're doing the thing that like no one wants to do in a lot of history departments and academic departments now, like look at a total picture. What is the direction that we're going in? What are some indicators that the end of history, which was announced by Fukuyama, is over and we're in another phase? Because they're really good readers of Fukuyama. So I'm not going to summarize them anymore. If you guys have questions and you're not familiar with BungaCast, just think about like Napoleon at Jena and Berlusconi in a bunga party. And then like those two images will create a sublation of an Aufhebung, and you'll have an insight into what they're doing. So I was really, when I read the book, when it first came out, I was really interested. I was starting to work on trauma, and I was really interested in how they're describing this historical moment, like the 90s, really, like the 90s. And when everyone's declaring that the great struggles are over, Fukuyama especially, like socialism is dead. And I saw this and their historicization is a really powerful way of saying like the projection of the end of history is really the end of the class struggle. And for me, what the professional managerial class wanted, it was like their fantasy, but there was some evidence that the history had ended. And Fukuyama is like perfect avatar of professional managerial class values. He's both a professor, he works in, think tanks, he's been educated at all the most prestigious places. And he's sad about the end of history. This is also what is important to understand. It's not like, oh my God, he's like, yay, the history's ended. He's kind of like, oh, the great struggles are over. Not class struggle for him, but ideological struggles. And we're in the state where he feels like, what are going to be the great narratives of human history? Are we headed in a direction that we can identify as sort of universal? All those things academics are like, no, we can't. But I think despite this, Hegel might have said, the universal direction of history is for greater human emancipation. That was evidence of this in 1800, evidence that moved out of the French Revolution, greater human freedom for all human beings, and higher exercise and institutionalization of reason as a way of governing human societies. And I would say like liberalism actually functions as a part of all of that, trajectory. But liberalism doesn't, in our time, is not so focused on freedom anymore. Liberalism wants the abolition of a very depoliticized notion of cruelty and the universalization of an idea of safety as, its ideals, right? We want to be safe from the coronavirus. We want to be safe from terrorists. We want to promote human rights as a universal principle. So I was really interested in how trauma studies fits into all of this. But I feel like I'm giving a lecture already. So I think I'm going to stop there for now, and maybe we can have more of a conversation. I was really interested in how trauma studies, as it arises in the 1990s, is definitely partaking of an end of history moment. Do you guys mind if I get really professorial and share a slide of Kathy Caruth's book on trauma studies that was promoted at the end, that came out in the mid 1990s. I would say like peak end of history. And I think it's kind of an astonishing document to what academics and what liberals thought of history. And there are a lot of circumstances that are, that background circumstances about how deconstruction had been associated with Paul de Man's Nazi collaboration. And so trauma studies, and Kathy Carruth is a really faithful student of de Man's, really wanted to create this kind of new ethics by which we would look at the historical and think of it in this think of trauma as this object that the academic, the deconstructive academic, the liberal academic, they wouldn't want to think of themselves as liberals because they thought of themselves as above politics, but how we are going to look at these theoretically informed, deconstructive academics in the late 80s, early 90s are going to look at history, because deconstruction has been blamed for being non-historical. So, okay, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So this is a page from how what she's going to talk about in terms of trauma studies. The experience of this, catastrophic experience produces post-traumatic stress syndrome. But I will start reading from here. I would propose that it is here, in the equally widespread and bewildering encounter with trauma, both in its occurrence and in the attempt to understand it, that we can begin to recognize the possibility of a history that is no longer straightforwardly referential. I mean, that's very deconstructive, right? But we want to talk about the possibility of a history that is no longer based on simple models of experience and reference, because that's for dummy heads. History based on experience and reference to like empirical reality, that's really silly. That's really stupid for trauma studies and for the deconstructive theorists. Through the notion of trauma, I will argue that we can understand that a rethinking of reference is aimed not at eliminating history, but at resituating it in our understanding, that is, at precisely permitting history to arise where immediate understanding may not. Now, that is one of the most obfuscatory but fascinating enunciations of the impossibility of approaching or understanding history and the aporetic, relationship of the deconstructive intellectual or academic with regard to trauma. So trauma, impossibility, the vulgarity of immediate understanding, all of these things are mobilized in this text about trauma and literature from 1996. And I feel like the straightforwardly referential idea of history is this attack on history itself, so that there will be no more instruments, dialectical, archival, to understand it, except for this textual reference to historical trauma, which for trauma studies was really privileged as the Holocaust. So I'm going to actually stop there, but I just want to say one thing about PTSD and post-traumatic stress syndrome and how important it was in 96. It was definitely associated with totalitarianism, and totalitarianism was, by this point, at the triumphal moment at the end of the Cold War, associated with socialism and fascism. So the Holocaust and the collapse of the Soviet state were kind of like similar events in this history that eluded our immediate understanding. And for me, George's, Philip's, and Alex's continued work in their podcast about the sort of post-political depoliticization of history and then history's return has been really, really important to me. Okay, so I've really gone on. And I'm going to be quiet now. And you guys didn't interrupt me or say anything, so I'm going to pass it to George first, or Alex?
I think I'm going first. So thanks very much, Catherine. And thanks for that discussion of our book. And thanks to the UCI Humanities Center as well for making this possible. Just to make a call back to Catherine's introduction. I mean, yeah, us as a podcast, we've seen Berlusconi riding in on his horse as an avatar of the end of history. And though Berlusconi isn't someone who indulges in sharing his own trauma, that's not his bag. He wants to sell himself as a fun, dynamic, successful, and sexy kind of guy. There you can already see an element which that Catherine touches on in her book in Virtue Hoarders, which is a breakdown of public and private and the flaunting of supposed private virtues as political factors, right? And so Berlusconi does that very well. And if you aren't very familiar with Berlusconi, just think of Trump. Basically, Berlusconi was Trump 20 years earlier. So to get started, actually, I wanted
Italian style.
Italian style, yeah, but maybe Trump is a bit Italian. Anyway, that's a conversation maybe for another time. What I want to do here is firstly just say that Catherine's book has been very helpful in pulling together several pieces that we lay out in the end of history, as well as adding a huge amount of color and depth to aspects that are in our book that concern the middle class socially, as well as the left politically. So what I want to do in kind of trying to stand Catherine's Virtue Hoarders and our the end of history up against one another is to discuss the PMC, the professional managerial class, in three historical phases, kind of following along the periodization that we propose in our book. So basically the post-war period until 1989, or let's say the Cold War period, 1989 until 2016, which is the real end of history period, and then 2016 until today, which we call the end of history. So the PMC, I think, as it was conceived and as Catherine discusses in her book, was seen as often a junior partner of the left, part of a kind of progressive alliance between the liberal middle class and the working class. But the PMC, at least until the 1960s, was very much the junior partner. What Catherine's book describes, and this kind of right at the beginning of the book, I think it's on page 1, is that since the 1960s, the PMC has sought to set itself apart, no longer following the lead of the working class, but kind of setting itself apart, seeing itself as a paragon of virtue. And it often does this against the working class. Basically, the failure of the 1960s revolt and the shadow that cast over the 70s and 80s led a lot of left-leaning middle class people to think that the workers had failed them. And so they went off in search of new subjects of history, right? So this could be ethnic and sexual minorities within society, or even kind of lumpen proletarians or criminal underclass, or indeed off in the third world, and to see kind of anti-colonial revolts,
you're breaking up.
Post-colonial struggles as the new subjects of. Am I okay now? Can you hear me all right? Am I still breaking up?
Now you're okay. I just wanted to, Amanda asked that maybe we should spell out professional managerial class more, but that's fine.
Okay. I mean, do you want to go ahead and do that as it's your bag, and then I'll carry on.
The professional managerial class, a term defined in 1977 by John and Barbara Ehrenreich, are people who are educated and credentialed, who dominate the liberal professions. Okay.
There we go.
Leave it at that.
And so what's interesting, I mean, I'm trying to maybe look at how the professional managerial class has changed or, has reoriented over recent history. So as I was saying, the PMC starts to see itself particularly as a cultural vanguard, not sexist and racist like the masses, that it has better habits and mores, that it believes maybe even in edgy transgression rather than normie morality, which is something that Catherine discusses in the book in reference to Angela Nagle's book, Kill All Normies. And in a more political context, you could see its pursuit of a certain sort of radicalism as always pursued against the masses. So, Hillary Clinton, who Catherine holds up as the arch professional managerial class, or an avatar of the professional managerial class, she denounced a large section of the masses as deplorables. The PMC in this phase in history is always in search of new frontiers for equality, especially if it antagonizes the masses. And we can see, for example, certain activist concerns today, for example, around trans politics. And I know I'm stepping into a hornet's nest. I'm not sure if that's the right metaphor, but I am, where whatever you might think specifically of the kind of trans issues, a lot of trans activists seem to find a lot of purpose in the fact that their reconceptualization of gender or the attempt to transcend the traditional understanding of the gender binary, the fact that that might antagonize a lot of people is an actual selling point rather than something to be overcome, to try to win people over. And so that kind of form of political practice of the PMC is often set against the masses rather than trying to pull the masses along in its political project. Okay, so what happens at the end of history? What happens as of the 1990s? Catherine's already referenced the sort of end of class antagonism, the end of naked class confrontation. You have the decline of trade unions, less working class participation in politics in all levels of politics and public life. And this allowed the PMC, which at this stage had grown and metastasized along with the growth in so-called jobs like symbolic analysts, the growth of academia, of the third sector, of NGOs and so on, of foundations, that the PMC kind of now is able to stand somehow on its own 2 feet and become this truly post-historical class. It could ignore real conflicts. It doesn't really believe in interests. It doesn't have any great revolutionary goals, as the old working class maybe once had, nor does it share the conservative imperatives that the big bourgeoisie has. What the PMC seeks to do, and this is something that Catherine outlines very well in her book, is basically an aim to perfect capitalism and to perfect it through its adherence to progressivism. So this is a world without material interests. For the PMC, there's only a hierarchy of knowledge. You have those who know, those who are educated. The PMC are characterized by having passed through institutions of higher education, and those who don't, which is to say the masses at large and populist politicians who played to their prejudices, as the PMC.
I just want to interrupt and say, it's all there in the Carruth literature and trauma book, because there are those people who expect the immediacy of history, and then there are those of us who understand trauma and the aporetic nature of the historical. And so what you described there is a perfect example of this kind of obfuscation and then expertise that happens almost in the same gestures.
And that obfuscation is often, I don't think that the PMC are thinking of themselves self-consciously as a class. In fact, it's very much the opposite. In this new world of the 90s and 2000s and 2010s even, where class has been evacuated from the scene, the PMC itself sees itself as universal. It's now outside history. It can then just dedicate itself to better management. So ensuring meritocracy is honored through equality of opportunity, and in seeking distinction for itself. So that's maybe through ethical consumption, for example. Again, here we see this element of the breakdown of public and private that I referred to just a second ago, where in this world of no more of a lack of grand ambitions, grand projects, no idea of social development, let alone revolution, the PMC's private sphere and its habitus takes on ever greater importance. So the middle sections of the middle chapters of Catherine's book are very much about, what the PMC eats, how it shops, how it raises its kids or its exercises, and how that's taken as public virtue rather than mere private preferences, which is what they actually are. And they're used in that exercise of public virtue as a way to chastise the masses. But again, because this is a world where class is no longer discussed, class no longer figures, the PMC themselves don't see what they're doing as forms of class domination. It's really just them being more advanced people as against the backwards people. Okay, so to round this out, what happens when the end of history comes to an end, right? So this is, in our book, we discuss this primarily as a moment in 2016, where the unresolved contradictions of the 2008 global financial crisis come home to roost. And they come home to roost in the US through the election of Trump and the rejection of managerial technocracy that he represents, and in the UK through Brexit and the rejection of the European Union and this sort of distant form of authority which is undemocratic and somehow alien, right? But of course, the end of history is in some ways a more universal thing than just the US and the UK, but they're so clearly expressed in 2016 in the US and the UK that's what we spend a lot of time talking about. So what happens as a consequence of these political splits is that the way I would put it is that you have a politicization and a radicalization of the middle class, and the middle class kind of splits. And so on the one hand, you have the PMC that I've been talking about, the professional managerial class, which is more liberal, more technocratic, more managerial. And on the other hand, you have the threatened old middle class or petite bourgeoisie, the lower of small business owners who are often more populist, more right wing, and maybe don't have the same adherence to credentialization that the PMC has. They're more oriented to the market, as against the PMC, who are more oriented to institutions and the state. A lot of what has happened, I think, in the past couple of years is that the end of history meant, or was meant to mean, a return of politics to the scene. So after politics had been pushed to the sides and everything was about consensus and about finding the correct technical responses to social questions, suddenly antagonism returns to the scene. But what's happened is that a lot of that antagonism has been channeled into a culture war. And that culture war, I think, fundamentally is a face-off between two faces of the middle class, between the PMC and between the petty bourgeoisie. And I think there's a really telling line in Catherine's book, which I want to just read out, which is that conservatives, which includes, kind of Fox News or right populists, Trump, etc., conservatives need a functioning and powerful PMC cadre to serve as punching bags for their politics of popular resentment. So here you have it laid out that that these two sides are in effect symbiotic, that the right populist politics needs the PMC, and it needs it, I think, to conceal its own absence of vision and lack of solutions. And the same applies vice versa. The liberal PMC needs this specter of both conservative elites in alliance with supposedly retrograde masses who are prone to demagoguery as a way to advance and to continue on its project of appearing progressive, of presenting as enlightened and progressive and more advanced than the masses, which it kind of seeks to leave behind, or at best to educate into being better citizens. So I think here we can ask a question. And maybe being a bit provocative here, but which might get us to the nub of what the PMC actually represents today. The kind of right populists who channel all this resentment about, kind of diminished horizons, about the condescension of the PMC, and fundamentally about declining living standards towards, the kind of expert class, the managers, the PMC as a whole. And in channeling that anger against them and channeling that resentment, what it, I guess, is putting on the table, or what it's proposing, is a world without the PMC, or at least a world where the PMC has been neutered and has lost the cultural authority that it currently has. In effect, stop the PMC from hoarding virtue. What is this image? What is this world that's being sold by the right populists? And I think it's really just in some ways the status quo ante. That world would be a world of a more disorganized capitalism. So you wouldn't have the PMC ensuring proper procedures are followed, the independence of institutions, that risk assessments are properly followed out, and that things are properly credentialized in the way they were. And you also wouldn't have the PMC ensuring a very minimum equality of opportunity. Now, what is this minimal equality of opportunity that the PMC propose? It's to make sure effectively that class domination remains colorblind, right? So you can't have any racial, sexual, gender advantages in life, right? But of course, you can have the blunt force of economic inequality fundamentally shaping life forever and forever. But it cannot have any class, it cannot have any racial or gender aspects to it, right? So just pure economic inequality. What is this vision of a world without the PMC that's proposed? This is a less organized capitalism, as I said, but it's also maybe a more vulnerable capitalism, one that's more vulnerable to overthrow. And so there we get back to what the PMC was defined as by Barbara and John Ehrenreich back in the 70s, which its role is fundamentally to reproduce capitalist culture. And so here, I think in this light, we can maybe see the PMC as a way of smoothing over the harsh aspects of capitalism. So what are we to conclude? The PMC then is not just the post-historical class par excellence, but is also perhaps an anti-revolutionary class.
Yeah, I would agree. Okay, there are some questions, but I think I'm going to save them and have George go next, and then hopefully we'll have some. I have some questions that I want to raise. I want to talk about an acronym that these guys came up with, neoliberal breakdown disorder syndrome, knobs, because we just love acronyms. Knobs, PMC. What else got? Oh, what
Yeah,
else
I
can
mean,
we do? PTSD. I want to talk about
okay.
knobs being the PTSD of the PMC, but
I
we'll
think
just...
I think that yeah, there's a lot of 3 and 4 letter acronyms there, but that's actually what I was going to talk about a little bit anyway. So hopefully I might try and cover that. But yeah, just to say thank you to Catherine for inviting us, and to Alka, Mad Inside for making this happen. I think this, we've been having this conversation, Catherine, you might remember April 2019, I think it was, recording an episode of the podcast on postmodernism, which I think was a really interesting one, and live in Southeast London. So yeah, great to be continuing this internationally across Zoom. So I think it was my suggestion, the title of this kind of discussion, the new class analysis perspectives from the academy and beyond. And so that's, you might say, quite a classically academic style title, anodyne, maybe not, but it's probably incumbent on me a little bit then to say what I was trying to get at, and why I think this captures some of the interesting things in our book, and certainly in Catherine's. So I think there has been in the last few years, and probably as a result of some of the things that Alex and Catherine have already talked about in terms of global politics, I would say a renewed importance of class-based analyses of politics. It's kind of strange to say that that these would have come back on the left, because you might say that they should never really have gone away. But you do see now, and maybe across the whole political spectrum, a lot of people talking about a kind of many potentially different names for this same group. So the PMC, Michael Lind talks about the managerial overclass. Joel Kotkin talks about the clerisy. There's certainly I think a recognition that there is a role, an increased role, an importance of the middle class.
Piketty calls them Piketty calls them a managerial elite too, global managerial elite. So that's important.
There's clearly something going on with the managers of the world, whether they're uniting or not. But what I think is particularly great about Catherine's book is that it's an analysis of how this class experiences the world, the professional managerial class. And in academies, you might call this their habitus, but it's certainly their cultural and moral world. The way that particularly these highly educated Americans, maybe some of whom resident in the great state of California, how they are living, raising their children. I think it definitely, I should also say, it resonated with me and my own kind of experience of the world, as probably a member of this class. But I think as Alex had already sort of said, we in our book we approach this from a slightly different angle and try to look at the specific response of this class to what I think Catherine correctly framed as a traumatic event. So particularly Brexit in the British context and Trump in the American context. How was it that this group of people class of people who have a particular authority, a moral, political, cultural authority, how did they respond to these two kind of signal events, which essentially show maybe that that authority is not absolute, that people may not listen to their expert advice. So yeah, and we talk about this in terms of neoliberal order breakdown syndrome, or NOBS, and it's essentially the response of this group who are not able to explain, to respond, to understand what's happened in 2016 in these two events. So I think the reason why I think this idea of new class analysis is so important, or why I would just kind of bring it back a little bit, not to get in too much into the definitions of classes, but I think there's a kind of a big thesis here, which I think is definitely worth us talking about a little bit, which is essentially that the defeat of the organized working class, particularly, well, certainly across the West, in the 80s and 90s, this deprives capitalism, deprives the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, of their dynamism. So if you have this situation where these two kind of main classes in society have lost the historic kind of dynamism that class struggle gives them, this potentially leaves the historical scene open for an increased importance of the PMC, of the middle class. And so, yeah, I think that's probably a more or less shared common starting point that we have. And I think one of the reasons why I enjoyed, and I think I've read it. We had an episode on this on the podcast, read it then, reread it. Now, I think the thing that really makes me think about Catherine's book, or Catherine's work more generally, is how, so virtue hoarders, this is what Catherine explains that this group do, but how do they turn this virtue, this kind of like moral superiority, into material gains? How do you make virtue pay? I think this is the $64,000 question, if you will. How do you move from the kind of the culture wars to the material basis? Like who wins, who loses? How do you, if you hoard this virtue, it's great to be virtuous, sure, but how do you get something out of it? And I think the big question that could potentially be a crucial one for politics in the coming few years across Western societies. And just a couple more quick reflections, because I can see the questions stack up, and it'd be great to get kind of back to roundtable discussion. In terms of the British context, this point about the split within the PMC that Alex talked about a little bit, I think it is quite clear that you have, certainly within the British PMC, this upper group who are in professions fairly economically stable, and then a lower group who are much more downwardly mobile. You could sort of say that the upper group are Liberal Democrats politically, the lower group Corbynites. The upper groups work in profession, the lower groups work for an NGO, say, and this lower group who can't get themselves onto the property ladder, who this is really what powered left populism. And I think this, as the left populists, so the Corbynite, the Sanders project, is very much in remission, or in it's probably just completely over now, you would say. Where does this group go? And I mean, my hypothesis would be that they will probably need to differentiate themselves from the working class to whom they are at risk of falling into. In the 2010s in Britain, you had this discourse around chavs, which might not be familiar to kind of to people watching or listening along. And this was essentially a construction of the white, specifically British working class, as racist, as xenophobic, as stupid, Burberry wearing idiots, essentially. Will this come back? Quite possibly. Has it already come back, but under different branding? Maybe. Is that same split replicated across different national contexts? That's another question. But I guess probably the big question here is, if we all accept this, what Catherine's already talked about from our book, and I think some of the key points of her book, that the PMC is certainly playing a political role of either direct or indirect opposition to working class interests. What do you want to do about it? There's some interesting international kind of comparisons here. Maybe there's in the Swedish case, there's kind of beginnings of a move against what's called in that context the transferiat, so another name for this kind of intermediate class. And so this is the idea that if you have this group of people who have this shared material interest, and it's not the same material interest as a bigger group, then mobilize that bigger group and take the state transfers away from this political group. So, I mean, I think that's always obviously the question: what are you going to do about it? And I think this is one of the questions which has come through in the chat.
That's right. So why don't we take Alka's question first, and then we can go through. So Alka asks, so what would be the way forward, as if we could rid ourselves of the foil of PMC populism? If we did rid ourselves of the foil of PMC populism, there would be a vacuum. And I think this kind of goes back to what Alex was describing is that if the right wins in, electorally in our sort of really, really damaged liberal societies, what you would have is not necessarily a vacuum. You would have chaos, raw economic exploitation. You'd have massive deregulation and that rawness, Alex is saying, is like that could actually lead towards like greater political change and confrontation. And I want to just say that when Trump was president, and I'm not nostalgic for him, except I am nostalgic for his tweets, there was a kind of anti-normativity. The PMC's power was shaken, deeply, deeply shaken, as with Brexit as well. And for me, as someone very far on the left, I thought that was more exciting, more possible, that there could actually be coalitions made. Our confidence in ourselves are shaken, and that, the centrist line, the centrist technocratic depoliticizing line of HRC and the mainstream Democrats, as well as, the Blairite Labour Party in Britain, were shaken by Trump and Brexit. And I felt like, wow, there's a possibility for real economic, political change here. There's a new politics. And now we've gone back into slumberland with Joe Biden. Everyone's like telling us to shut up, be quiet. This is normal. This is how all the experts are in charge. No worries. And we're back into that kind of political stasis that actually the end of history describes so well. And so we're caught, I think, in this infernal cycle between when a right-wing populist rejection of PMC values creates actually an opening for the left, Corbyn and Sanders to begin, and then the sort of centrist liberal rise to power. I don't know what you would call Boris Johnson, but certainly Joe Biden is actually much more disciplinary of the left and the far and socialists than I would say like anything else than the right wing electoral victories. The other thing I wanted to say was. Okay, I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, Alex, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to, yeah.
What would be if we got rid of the PMC populist antagonism? What would be next? What would be the?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, what you've hinted at there, is that what you're already seeing is something that Chris Bickerton calls techno-populism, which is a fusion between technocratic managerialism and the populism that we've seen challenge technocracy over the past decade. Really, you could call the 2010s the populist decade, and you can see Boris Johnson doing that. Joe Biden to a certain extent as well. Joe Biden represents basic continuity with the Trump administration, in my view, and so you can see there even the kind of centrist Democrats being able to be flexible and incorporate certain populist messaging, certain populist policies or approaches as a way of like reconstituting their authority. And you can see, like, I think the example in the UK is probably most clear, where Boris Johnson is able to kind of shed the more, like, let's say, neoliberal aspects or Thatcherite aspects of the Conservatives' policy to become more, I don't want to say welfarist because that'd be too grand, but to a certain extent try to win over sections of the working class, which always used to vote Labour, by offering them greater support or maybe greater, try to rebalance regional inequalities, for example.
That's not happening here in the United States. Like it's more cruel than you could possibly imagine.
It is, but you do have like the Biden administration spending a lot more than it did previously. So I'm not saying that that's like some great response to some great social demand, but there is an aspect of kind of, the cash transfers coming in and people kind of, being like, okay, well, at least they're giving us something. I think populism has forced the technocrats, to put it this way, to at least respond and take into account popular anger in a way that for the past 30 years, they've been able to just completely ignore it.
Oh, you're you could,
you could say that, in fact, the populists forced the technocrats to kind of stage a bit of a striking back. You could say the wider political context here of COVID, this is very much a restoration the power of technocracy. Like I think it's difficult to argue with that. We are currently in a across the world in societies where the expertise, particularly medical expertise, is having a real social and political real force.
And it really creates this kind of moralizing divide too. And we've seen this, I wanted to call like everything like mask hoarders, vaccine hoarders, quarantine hoarders. Like people really, really are divided along whether or not you're obeying the mandates and whether or not you have skepticism. And if you do, then you're like a crazy, nut job who, is questioning COVID policy. So questioning COVID policy right now is like going to push you to the. I can't even say it because I'm in a university setting.
I would say that the whatever you think about the actual the rules themselves, that certainly the kind of the cultural status and the like medical experts today are household names. I mean, that if you had said that 5 years ago, that would have been quite surprising. But now it's and I think it is correct to link it to the structure of the conflicts that we've had in the intervening period, because it is ultimately where does that authority come from and where does the political power come from?
So, and I think that. Sorry, George. No, I was just going to say that, your point I think is absolutely right about it being an attempt at restoration. I guess the question is, and maybe kind of looking at what Alka was sort of asking in terms of what next, is that there might be an overreach, right? Might be an overreach from the technocrats, and we're already seeing a lot of resistance to that in Europe. And even if it doesn't lead to revolts, what it's leading to is a greater social fragmentation where the basic question of knowledge puts into question, right? So large swathes of people just simply do not believe what the message that they're told anymore about, about science or whatever else, about epidemiology and so on.
So I think, in 2022, there is going to be punishment of the democratic alignment with with this technocratic authoritarianism. But I want to move on. Joanna Jaffa has a question. It's not really a question, so I'm going to say I'm not. We're not going to try to answer this question, Johanna. There are people who want to be private about their traumas, and they have to advertise their privacy online or something like that. And it's
So do you mind if I just not
please.
Directly on this, but just jump in, because I mean, a lot of your initial comments were on trauma, and
Thanks.
I did try and pose you this question before we started. But I think it's a really interesting kind of lens through which to try to understand contemporary subject formation, if that's not too jargony a way to put it. Like, how do we understand who we are, essentially? Because you might say previously in the 90s, particularly, you had this ideas of risk, Ulrich Beck's works, insecurity, like that's what the state is there to protect people from risks, from interpersonal risks. And you said about sort of safety and anti-cruelty. I think this is where the idea of human rights comes in, and looking internationally, maybe even humanitarian intervention. But there's so Peter Ramsey's book, The Insecurity State, he says there's a difference between the vulnerable subject and the vulnerated. I think he specifically put that to make it difficult to say, the vulnerated subject. So the harm has already happened. So trauma is like the harm, it's not the harm that could happen, it's the harm that's already happened. So does this basically mean that, and so I didn't put this question to you fully before, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, Catherine, but do you think this like, if trauma is the way that we understand ourselves as subjects, is that possibility of the state protecting people, is it already defeated? It's already like the horse has already bolted, like the trauma's already been suffered, so you have to be restorative rather than protective.
I don't really have that. That's a really interesting question. But I don't think that the state is about that the sort of liberal state and the liberal public face of trauma informed policies are about protecting us from ever having trauma. I think one of the things about this kind of vulnerability that is fetishized by the liberal PMC is that we're always already traumatized, right? And this kind of what the state wants to do is include trauma as part of its policy because we're always already traumatized. So rather than having this idea of, someone asked about Christopher Lasch, but the early Democrats, like, we're being very Eurocentric. This is what I'm trained in. I'm in a Western-based university. I'm sorry, but if you have other examples, please put them in the chat and educate me, school me. But the earliest forms of democracy had to do with a kind of civic virtue that had to do with both the notions of sacrifice of your self-interest, sacrifice even of your body, sacrifice of your personal well-being for the well-being of the state. That's like really important part of Athenian democracy, and that's like held up as our ideal. So that subject of Athenian democracy is not valorized because they are vulnerable. They're valorized because they're stoic, because they have a kind of civic virtue. Here, there's been this transformation, and I think it actually has to do with the end of history. I haven't thought about it completely through. Like, I think up until 1972, we probably had a really flawed, fucked up, patriarchal, repressive form of civic virtue where only really plain spoken white men who sounded like your pilot on your last flight could operate politically. Now we want to include this account of trauma in our very subjects, and we're rewarded if we're rich and famous already for being able to publicize that trauma. Prince Harry, who I have a soft spot for because he's a ginger, and Oprah have started a new Apple TV series called The Me You Don't See, about famous people telling us about how they've suffered these enormously terrible, terrible personal events. Lady Gaga has been sexually assaulted. She talks about that. Harry, of course, talks about the loss of his mother. Oprah came out as having been a victim of childhood sexual assault, so she can maintain this kind of thing. There is this kind of production of empathy that I think goes back to what Alex was saying about the PMC's willingness to perfect capitalism. Like, look, there's all this cruelty, but let's create this kind of highly, this very popular, easily consumable forms of empathy that are really going to be profitable for Apple and Oprah and Prince Harry. So that vulnerability, the staging of that vulnerability, is highly restricted, reified, and it's become content production. We don't really want to hear about the ordinary working class person's vulnerability. No one wants to hear about that.
And I think this is part of a shift toward, this is an old discussion, but towards post-material values. And I guess, I just want to say, obviously, that I feel the same as Prince Harry, as someone who suffered the trauma of being ginger. I must be the same as a royal. That's the function of trauma, right? It has this equalizing effect of empathizing with powerful people and so on. But I think that's kind of the question when you transfer these questions over to kind of the realm of the post-material, where trauma is a good example of that, or at least the kind of commodified trauma that Catherine, you describe, where questions of material interests get kind of pushed to the side because everybody has a story of trauma and overcoming that they can use, right? Or that you could try to shape one for yourself.
This is absolutely right. The inclusive language of trauma excludes economic trauma. They don't want to hear about you being I'm down to my last 20 and I have to feed my family.
But
that's
I think
not that's not on the media can't see.
What I was going to say when Alex's point made me think there's also it's kind of obvious that everyone has their own story, and everyone's story being different means that it's of course individualized, and so any structural causes of trauma are obfuscated or individualized and narrativized in such a way that it's not seen to be a social production. It's very individualistic, and it's very and that's part of what gives, I guess, that particular story its authenticity, that it's not like other stories. It's unique particularly to that celebrity.
And yet the ways in which the celebrities frame their story tell are enormously similar. I have like video clips of the stuff. I'm not going to show it today right now, but it's like, yes, everyone is different. There's this, talking about, there's this a lot of lip service being paid to like the difference of our stories. And I do believe that everyone has been traumatized, but I don't believe that this kind of PMC modeling of trauma storytelling is a way of getting any kind of healing done individually or collectively or socially. I think it's actually what Alex was saying, more like it's actually a block to creating any of them.
I mean,
it actually prevents that happening.
I guess my question is sort of what's the material aspect of this? And it seems like there's a, if your analysis of the professional managerial class is that it's there's a lot of ambitious individuals, highly credentialized, and fewer, or maybe even the same number of desirable positions in the media, in academia, so on and so forth. Then I guess the question becomes the extent to which this is a sort of a tool in the intra PMC competition for places. And I think this is one of the things which the Virtue Hoarders book is really makes you think, is like, okay, so all of this virtue hoarding that's being done is because if you are more virtuous than your PMC competitor, you can kind of elbow them out the way, and you get the whatever it is you're competing for. I mean,
yeah. No, I think that's true. There's another term. All right, there's another question here, but I just also wanted to say that with regard to like this reified language of trauma and healing, there's another term that the knobs love is resilience. So they hate fragility. You have to be resilient about trauma. They know how to get it done there. I wanted to talk more about this sort of scapegoating of the working class with regard to this language of tolerance and trauma, but we'll come back to that. So there's another question here. To be provocative, would we say that the PMC has the revolutionary class imperative to pass from a capitalism dominated by the bourgeoisie, the owner class, to a hyper-capitalism of Lenin-type imperialism dominated by the expert coordinator class? Ooh, that's a good question.
I think doesn't get the causality backwards. I mean, I think it's an interesting point, but it's the fact that Lenin type imperialism or monopoly capitalism is exactly what produces the PMC, right? It produces this relatively wide section of society. I mean, I say relatively because of course it's not a majority in society, but whatever, maybe in somewhere like the US, maybe 20% of society falls into that.
25%.
Okay. Yeah, where you're formally a worker, you're employed in a large institution, but you have much greater autonomy than other workers, and often have managerial responsibilities which set you apart from the rest. And then of course, but the whole point about reproducing capitalist culture. And so it's only in a situation of imperialism in that historical phase that you get this PMC becoming so important, and actually pushes to the side the authority of the traditional bourgeoisie who used to directly own factories. Now they don't. You have shares and things and so on.
So the grand bourgeois, who owned a factory, could cultivate their taste in aesthetics. We don't see that anymore. That's gone. Yeah. Those people are not doing that anymore. Okay, but I did want
to just raise something which is interesting, just in relation to the kind of anti-PMC thing, which is that people seem to hate, I mean, the kind of populist insurrection as it is, hate the PMC more than they do the actual bourgeois, right? Than the billionaires. And that's something that's maybe worth exploring as a kind of to tack that onto the question.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That is, we need to come back to that. Remind me to come back to that. But we've got another question here. Isn't knobs or neoliberal order breakdown syndrome just another case of the culture of narcissism, in the sense that it seems to be about a class being completely and utterly unable to imagine different material interests and cultural preferences to their own?
Yeah, I think this, I would kind of put it a different way. And I might, so let's see if I can kind of explain this clearly. I think the only way or it was an important aspect of the Brexit vote and Trump that all of the professional politics analysts didn't see it coming. You have two outcomes, and Like, it was such a shock. And what explains the kind of incomprehension and the inability to like think, yeah, there could have been there could be two outcomes, one of the two has happened, this is not like some like million to one shot or whatever. And I think the only way that that can be explained is because this class is socially very detached from the nation. Like, I think it has to be put in national terms, and I mean, and that is a sort of narcissism that but I think it has a material cause. There is a real decline of or a real cultural political distance, such that the political elites didn't understand their co-citizens. And I think
I
that's
think that's
the
a really
only thing that I think explains it.
that I think that's a really important point, and that has to do with what Alex had talked about a little earlier too, which is this kind of symbolic analyst who lives in this dematerialized world, and one of the material bounds of our existences has to do with both the place in which we are and that place being situated within a nation with an infrastructure, a national interest, etc. And that the PMC is so divorced from that sensibility now. And this goes into the next question, which I thought was really interesting, and I want to answer this question. Thought experiment. What would Hegel make of the PMC? I know he struggled with not being able to see how the poor and rich rabble could be sublated, but if memory serves, he had high hopes for the highly educated. Many people say Hegel was a theorist of the national state bureaucracy. Like, he hoped, what his hopes were for Napoleon, we've got to remember this, conquering Europe was creating a rational bureaucracy, standardized economic and political institutions, because if you think of what Napoleon was sweeping through, he was really sweeping through Germany, the states of Germany, the states of what we know today as Italy. And these are some of the most backward, feudal, like court societies who were still nostalgic for like Louis XIV type monarchical rule. And Napoleon was sweeping through Europe for Hegel, destroying the institutions of this atavistic, really, really horrific Catholic, in many cases, bourgeois aristocracy. Like, he was bringing in modernity. So Hegel's thinking about modernity. Now, the PMC doesn't have to be reactionary. It is reactionary today, but as we think of like bureaucracy or state bureaucracies, or that Bismarck eventually puts into place to redistribute economic treasures, you need good institutions. And I think Hegel understood that. You need disciplined professionals. I am not anti-professional. Like, here's the thing, is that I feel like the PMC today has completely reneged on any kind of professional standard. So, Alex, when you were drawing the line between like this, highly regulated PMC, liberal triumph, and then this chaotic, Mad Max, like right-wing populist state, I feel like we have the worst of all worlds. We have this like right-wing Mad Max, regulatory capture state where, big pharma funds Fauci and funds the CDC, and we have like this sclerotic, expertise, technocratic rule as well. But the thing is, it's like within the core of every single institution right now involved with the professional managerial class, and you guys talk about this too, there's a naturalized like complicity between capital and these institutions, which should have been shielding us from the market. And you can call that corruption, or you can call that you can call that the reality of our, post-neoliberal age, which is basically like gangster capitalism married to a very, very, very out of touch upper nether region professional managerial class, with like lots of people at the bottom scrabbling to get into that out of touch world, because everyone wants to be that out of touch.
Yeah, I mean, and you could ask the question, like, does that professionalized bureaucracy that Hegel dreamt of, I mean, one, it obviously has accomplished its goal, but it was an agent of modernization, along with the army, actually, in many cases, which itself has its own bureaucracy. But leaving that to one side, if it's achieved its goal, we should ask, is the professional bureaucracy, effectively the PMC, is it an agent of modernization today? And probably not. I mean, I think it's trying to squeeze out the last possibilities for modernization, which is what I referred to at the beginning, which is to create a kind of colorblind class domination, right? This kind of perfect capitalism where you can't have any like basically it's not going to be white men ruling things. It's going to be truly meritocratic, and you'll just have naked economic domination and exploitation without extra economic elements, right?
Okay.
That's the last step of modernization that you can pursue, and that's it. It doesn't have any great dreams of social transformation, of even, for example, dealing with climate change through geoengineering or through grand initiatives. No, it wants to kind of recoil from modernity rather than kind of seize its possibilities.
And when it sees the aberration like cruelty, a human rights violation, it can only imagine the intervention as being perfectly aligned with American national security agendas. Okay.
So Hegel would hate the PMC. That was the answer to the question. Sorry.
Oh, so Hegel would love the upright state bureaucrat. But,
yeah, maybe, yeah.
Right, but he would hate the PMC. Okay. So Tara continues, like, should we, acknowledge the role that the Democratic Socialists play in this unconscious role in the PMC? I'm going to skip that one, Tara. I think you asked a really, really interesting question before, but I'm just going to stay away from criticizing DSA for the moment, and we can talk about this in other venues. Paul O'Neill, do you agree that the trauma sharing is useful because it is seen as the best form of networking?
I think there's, in some ways, one of the most like distasteful parts of the like public performance of trauma is that it is that you can see in the attempt that celebrities or others have of trying to kind of produce empathy in you. You can see how this like genuine human experience is being instrumentalized, and that's why I think it's very transparent. So I guess to kind of take Paul O'Neill's question from another angle, it's like, I mean, I guess there must be a way in which this performance of trauma amongst certain groups, not amongst everybody, but amongst like PMC types, perhaps, it is a signal of a kind of shared cultural social identity. So there must be some sort of function there, because I think like not like being open and talking to people and sharing your experiences, that's a good human thing to do, and it just shows how the PMC can ruin everything.
The other thing I was going to say was, Jennifer Silva's book about pain in the coal region, former coal mining regions, gives us a really different picture of how these working class former miners think about suffering. Like, their narrative about suffering is not about sharing, overcoming. It's about like enduring pain without necessarily finding a public venue for it. And she does this like, careful sociological analysis series of interviews in a town that she calls Coldbrook. And these working class people have a very different view of what they're going through. And they actually live with physical pain from the mining and a lot of psychological pain. But the instrumentalization of trauma, it has not reached them, So, William Rose, next question. Doesn't the trauma industrial complex transform problems that are rooted in economic precarity into personal problems that we all empathize with, laundering out any political implications? To Catherine's point, this is resilience again, even resilience to making ends meet. So the resilience narrative, when it is lined up with poverty and economic suffering, always has and now I'm better, and now I make more money. And that's like, and the resilience allowed me to get myself in a more economically stable situation. And so after all of this suffering, after all these rejections, from jobs, I finally did this, and this. And the transformation of the personal problem into something we can empathize with is really important. But I want to say something like more provocative than that. I think that the PMC in trauma industrial complex only fetishizes traumas that rich people can also have. That's the only kind of trauma they want to hear.
Yeah. So I mean, I like this question. I think there's, that individualization, I think, which I mentioned earlier. I think that is important, because the more personal a problem is, the more atomizing and the more difficult it is to respond to, the more overwhelming it seems. So there's a definite, like, I was going to say it's depoliticization, but it's not. It's a political strategy, because of course, like, one of the first stages in, that old socialist project of taking control is being a subject that has the desire to rule collectively. And the more that the problems are seen as individual ones, the more that kind of impotence to change things, because if it's you against the world, that's a pretty long odds. So I think it is, it's not just laundering out the political aspects, but it's actually like making people feel more isolated and more atomized. So it has a kind of, I would say, another layer to it as well.
But I also think that the PMC producing trauma as content allows people to have a purely voyeuristic relationship to the experience of the other. Like, oh, that's horrible. There are legitimately horrible things that have happened to people who are rich and famous, but we have this. But the thing about film studies and theories of the gaze is we are protected from what we're witnessing, and so it's a kind of entry into I'm just agreeing with you, George. Okay, so let me move on to the next question. This is really fascinating, but I wonder whether abstract discussions about the role that trauma, identity, fragility, and abuse play in discourse is really operating at the wrong register. Yeah, I think so. The point is that the whole paradigm of the personal as the political gives infinite latitude to those who want to derail political discussions. Totally agree. The question I have is not what is wrong with the discourse. I'm satisfied that it is terrible, but how do we actually respond when this shit is deployed and weaponized? I have been facing this in activism for 20 years, and I have still no idea how to deal with it. I don't know, but I definitely think this thing is about the use of this kind of very weaponized trauma discourse is about shutting down discussion.
Well, I guess the question is whether solidarity is possible, like whether the trauma is individuating and sufficiently individualized that you can't express solidarity because you haven't had that same experience with somebody, or whether you can. Because I mean, this doesn't answer this question at all. There's no easy response, but yeah, sorry, go on, Alex.
No, I think, like, in fact, it often seems to be an opportunity for negative solidarity rather than solidarity, which is to say, I'm struggling, so why should I care about someone else?
You don't know what I've been through. So you have no right to
exactly. I have my problems, and this can be deployed in any sorts of measures. I mean, my answer to that would be to try to always enforce a division between public and private. Though maybe I'm not that old, but maybe it makes me look like an old.
Don't worry, Alex. You're old at heart. You're old at heart, like me.
That is just not operative in this world. Yeah, I'm happily so. But to say these are personal matters, I'm sympathetic. If we want to talk about it personally afterwards, that's fine. But it's just not something which is appropriate to a public discussion.
Yeah. You almost have to perform you have to perform this new etiquette, which is, I'm really sorry that happened to you, but what does it have to do with our discussion? And at that point, you're like basically Satan in these activists. So I'm not sure we've helped you out, Sam, but we don't have the protocols for preventing you from becoming Satan.
We can just say that we have sympathy, we have solidarity with your plight there.
We know how you feel. Eli Senich, I'm not sure that I get the causality backwards there. Oh, this was feudalism brought forth a bourgeoisie and capitalism. This is in response to Alex. Why can't advanced capitalism bring forth a managerial class that implements fuller imperialism? So I'm going to answer this question very briefly, and then we have to go on to another question, which is that I think that there's the structures were there in the British Empire to produce a class out of its work, out of the brightest members, most ambitious members of the petit bourgeoisie, and send them out to rule the empire. They would come back without, social status, but with capital. So this idea of creating a clerisy that would execute the functions of empire are actually very old. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I do. There have been people who have said to me that I give too much power to the billionaire class, the capitalist class, that the PMC has actually exceeded the power of the capitalists, like with regard to like state pensions and things like that. So this is what I think Eli is also saying, is that there's a possibility that the PMC is now displaced the bourgeoisie as a ruling class. But we've answered your question, Eli. I'm afraid this is not like a really satisfying answer, but we've got more questions and our time is limited. So I'm going to go on to Josh Kearns. What role do you see environmental constraints playing in the evolution of the PMC? PMC affluence is derived through economic globalization and isn't sustainable. It seems that economies will have to substantially relocalize in the coming years. Working class people fill many or most of the primary producer roles, e.g., farmers, mechanics, builders, that underpin the workings of the economy and actually make everything work, fix broken stuff. Do you think environmental constraints will force a reorientation of swaths of the PMC towards the working class and the essential parts of the economy?
Can I go ahead?
No, my answer is no, but yeah, you have a more.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. I'm not convinced that environmental constraints will impose themselves economically on rich world nations. Like, just don't think it's going to happen, or certainly not in the near future. I'm sure there's going to be some attempts to sort of, reshoring some and shortening supply chains in pursuit of resilience, maybe a different sort of resilience to the one that we were talking about before. But maybe there's some connection there, some and that emphasis on resilience. But I think fundamentally, most environmental politics as pursued by the PMC, that is, and it's important to remember, a class which is divorced from direct production, and who, if you're a consultant, for example, you're not directly involved in production, even in the public, even in the private sector. Much less an academic or someone who works in the culture industries and so on. Your world is consumption. And so the only conception of responding to environmental problems is not through some Promethean grasping of the possibilities that modernity provides, for example, building out nuclear power, but recoiling from consumption to limit consumption. And whose consumption is going to be limited? Most likely the working classes. So I'm very skeptical of a lot of the environmental solutions that are on the table at the moment, because they seem punitive. And won't make life actually better for people, and might not even really resolve the environmental crisis that we face.
Well, a lot of our lefty friends, let me just say this quickly. Yeah. A lot of our lefty friends have said, that the environmental movement is completely dominated by PMC values. Like, when they talk about the environment, the last thing they're talking about is the working class. Like, they care more about the environment than about people. So the sort of saturation of PMC values within the environmental movement is one of the biggest problems we have today, I think, in terms of getting to really sustainable, renewable energy.
I think I'm not sure I agree with the two of you in terms of the answer to this question. I mean, so my reading would be that environmental kind of attitudes, and maybe this is what you were saying just there, Catherine, is sort of one of the domains of virtue that PMC can hoard. So I think, to kind of answer Josh's question directly, environmental constraints will force a reorientation of swathes of the PMC towards the working class. Yes, I think this could very well happen if you change the word reorientation. And I think that is like a forcing downwards, because if environmentalism is, one way you could put it is an ideology of capitalism in retreat from production for whatever reason, whether it's like justified objective environmental constraints or not. But I think there is potentially a downward pressure, if there's a downward pressure on production, a downward pressure on the size of the PMC. And what will happen, some of those PMC they'll be forcibly reorientated. downwards into the working class. So I think maybe that's not the logic that this question was getting to, but I think there could well be, for environmental reasons, increased competition within the PMC, and some could well drop out and be downwardly mobile into the working class, I would say.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Tara wanted to say, to go back very quickly, I didn't want to avoid the DSA question, the Democratic Socialists of America question. I do feel like that political organization is not a working class centered organization anymore. It is an organization of young, precarious members of college educated people who are aspirational PMC. And one of the things that I didn't want to do was like punch down, because Dave Chappelle told me not to punch down. And I don't, and I think that this aspirational class has assumed the values of the political entity that they want to influence or enter, which is the Democratic Party. And that's all I'm going to say. It's an aspirational, it's a political entity that could be left, that could be working class oriented, but is not at the present. Although there are very good things happening within that organization, its dominant ethos is one of aspirational PMC liberals. Sorry, guys.
Can I just jump in here really quickly? This Tara's question: best practice PMC intervention tips. It sounds like you're asking us to say if someone that is showing signs of being PMC, what should you do? Well, I think the first thing is to listen non-judgmentally to what they have. No, don't listen to them. I think that's in fact.
We don't have that. Oh yeah, everyone wants best practice. Make jokes. Start cursing a lot. I don't know. I'm exhausted every day by my PMC rage containment attempts, but I'm just I'm tired. This is what they also like to say on Twitter. I'm tired. I'm so tired. And I don't know what else to say. Okay, Nadja, Navarro's question. Do you see a connection between the replacement of political action by personal consumer choices and the substitution of collective empathy as basis for political action by individual trauma? Is it to immobilize any meaningful action for the masses and an explanation for voter fatigue?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. My answer is yes.
Well put. Yeah, I think so.
Well put. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Good way of putting that too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is there a link between the kind of the ideology of choice and the performance of trauma? I don't know. It's a good question.
And it goes back to sort of an old school thing that Alex proposed, which is that it's actually very difficult to have true empathy. And if you have this like constant spread of like private experience and then the expectation of public expressions of empathy, you're diminishing your capacity for private empathy and trivializing someone else's trauma too.
And I think this is something that you see today in the resistance to kind of PMC discourse, which is you have to care. You have to care about this. This is this new cause that you have to care about, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting for everyone.
And that's why it's so cathartic. The far right and Reddit and all that like trolling stuff on the internet is actually catharsis, because their whole attitude is we don't care. I don't care.
Yeah.
I don't care. Like, you're doing this, I don't care. And I have a son who's 20 years old who's actually introduced me to like what troll memes are, what troll culture is, and this anti-PMC, directly anti-liberal. And it's like the opposite. So even if we have this like really insane, enforced empathy, we have the emergence of a whole culture that's based on cruelty, sadism, online, low value cruelty, say, in troll culture. Okay, this is our last question. My question, Cheryl Hudson, is about what you think will happen now in response to the knobs pushback in the form of COVID regulations and the like. There's a lot of anger and an upsurge in conspiracy theories to explain what is happening, because it is so illogical, and also a massive decline in trust in institutions and leaderships. There's no political vehicle, but there are mass protests. Will it explode? Is it only self-harming? Oh, wow. What a last question. Okay. Good question.
Yeah, it's the big question at the moment, because there does, at least in the, it's very clear in the British context that there's not, there is conspiracy explanations. There's a great deal of just decline, basically the evacuation of trust in political institutions, but there's no vehicle of representation. There's no alternative project. If to take the British political context, Conservative Party is putting forward this set of regulations. The Labour Party says we just want a more technocratic solution. So there isn't really a political vehicle. So, it's stasis, inertia is more likely than anything else.
But also we've been isolated for almost 18 months. So the antisocial nature of the present seems to be, only exacerbating suspicion without organized political opposition. Okay, guys, I'm sorry we didn't get to, there's some very, very good, there's another good question about Winnicott and resilience, but maybe Sebastian and I could talk about this afterwards. We are at the end of our time. And
thank you so much, Catherine, George, and Alex. Our goal with these ideas with impact programs is to bring humanities faculty in conversation. And this was definitely a conversation, not just between the three of you, but with a very participatory audience, and who clearly are thinking about these same issues. And just reading through the questions was a really educational opportunity for me, and very thought-provoking. So we greatly appreciate both the intellectual work that you're doing, but also the ways in which you are thinking through how these intellectual ideas actually play out in the real world, so to speak. So on behalf of our audience, I thank you very much. And on behalf of Alka as well, but Alka can thank you herself since she's here.
I just want to make one last plug for the pod before Alka comes on. You can subscribe at all the places you look for your podcast. The Patreon is really great too. It's BungaCast, and they do reading groups. BungaCast does incredible public education in matters and you'll hear a lot of discussions like this. And maybe less censored, because it's podcast and it's the Wild West of broadcast media. But these guys are really doing the Lord's work in the world of left podcasts.
Well, Catherine, I thank you sincerely for bringing us all together. And thank you, Alex and George, for joining us from around the globe, it seems like. We really hope you found it to be a beneficial conversation. And just to emphasize, until almost the very end, there were over 50, actually consistently 60 audience members. So obviously this, I think it's a significant number. So it's about these ideas actually opening up conversation. That is the real value and the impact that you're having. So thank you.
Yes, we didn't lose the audience halfway through. They stayed. So thank you everyone for coming. And this was live stream on Facebook. Yes, that's, I guess, probably there's a lot to say about that. But the video will be available there, and we'll be putting up the video on our Humane Center YouTube channel, so you can send more people to hear this conversation. So thank you again, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. See you all around virtually and in real life.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.